"I'm not the woman you wrote to," she said. "He married her before she could leave." The letter was still in my coat pocket the morning she stepped off the stage. I'd read it so many times the crease had gone soft, like old skin. Evangeline Marsh, it said. 31 years of age. Schoolteacher out of Cheyenne, handy with a garden. No children from the first marriage, the husband dead of a lung sickness before their second anniversary. The man in Abilene who ran these arrangements had written her out neat and plain, half a page. I'd carried that half page through 2 hard winters and some of the loneliest months I'd spent since coming to this valley. The deadfall coach came in around 10 in the morning, dust cloud first, then the creak and jangle, then the wheels locking up on the grade into town. 3 passengers climbed down. A cattle buyer I knew by sight, wide as a barn door, who'd been in and out of Hatcher Valley for 2 seasons. A preacher who looked like he'd spent the journey with his eyes shut and his lips moving. And her. She wasn't what I'd pictured. I don't know what I'd pictured exactly. I'm not a man who pictures things as a rule, but I noticed she was younger than 31. Maybe 5 years younger, maybe more, dark-haired. She carried a canvas bag that was too light for a woman moving permanent to a new territory. No trunk, no hatbox. Just the one bag, held with both hands in front of her, like she might need to turn and run and wanted to be sure she had her hands free. She had on a coat that didn't fit the shoulders right, like she'd borrowed it in a hurry or bought it off someone who was bigger across the back. The sleeves were almost right, but the shoulder seams sat wrong, and I noticed this because I notice things. It's a habit I never got rid of from another life. I took off my hat. She looked at me and then looked past me, the way a person does when they're checking their exits without wanting you to know they're doing it. "You be Emmett Good," she said. It wasn't a question. "I would." She set the bag down, squared herself up. There was something rehearsed about what came next, the way a person rehearses something they know is going to land badly, has rehearsed it on a long coach ride with nothing to do but go over it again. "I'm not the woman you wrote to," she said. "Evangeline Marsh is my cousin. She couldn't come. She married someone else in April and she didn't know how to tell the agency, and I didn't know about any of it until 2 weeks ago, and She stopped, drew a breath, kept her eyes level on mine. "I came because someone had to explain in person. I thought that was the decent thing." She waited. The cattle buyer was already walking toward the saloon. The preacher was being helped down by the driver who was making faces about it. The stage dust was still settling on my boots. I held her gaze for a moment. Then I bent down and picked up her canvas bag. "You hungry?" I said. She blinked. "I pardon." "I asked if you were hungry. The ride from Pueblo takes most of a day, and Vellard serves a decent plate of beans." "Mr. Good, I don't think you understood what I understood." I started walking. After a moment I said, without turning, "What's your name?" A pause behind me, long enough that I thought she might just stand there in the street and let me walk away with her bag. Then her footsteps, quick, catching up. "Clara," she said, "Clara Finch." I should tell you something about why I'd written to that agency at all, because otherwise none of the rest of this makes much sense. I'm not a soft man, never have been. I don't say that to sound hard, like a man who wants you to know he's weathered. It's just what I am, the way some wood is dense and some wood isn't, and the reason doesn't much matter at this point. I grew up on a ranch in eastern Colorado where the wind came straight across from the Dakotas and didn't meet much to slow it down, and there wasn't money for anything that wasn't necessary, and necessary was a short list. My father was a quiet man who worked himself to a shadow by 60 and was dead by 62. My mother outlasted him by 12 years mostly because she was too ornery to give the ground the satisfaction. I picked up something from each of them, though I've sometimes wondered if I got the mix exactly right. I came to Hatcher Valley in 1881. I was 40 years old and I'd spent 20 of those years doing work that I won't describe in full, except to say that some of it was lawman work and some of it was other work, and the line between the two kinds was sometimes thinner than polite company would like to believe. I'd been contracted at various times to move cattle, to move money, to move men who had decided they didn't want to be moved. I'd ridden with some rough outfits, and I'd also ridden against them, and I'd spent time on both sides of enough situations that I'd developed a particular kind of education you can't get any other way. I had a place now, 380 acres on the east bench above the dry Cimarron. Good grass, a creek that ran most of the year and barely at all in August, soil that would grow things if you treated it properly. A house I'd spent 2 winters making into something a person could actually live in, not just survive in, but live. Solid walls. A real floor, not dirt. A chimney that didn't smoke back. 2 windows in the main room that faced west so the afternoon light came in. A bedroom with a door that latched properly. I'd built it for someone to live in besides me, though I hadn't known that when I started. I thought I was just building it right because building something wrong never sat well with me. But looking back, I think I was building it for somebody. The arrangement with the agency, that was Nate Aldrich's idea. Nate was my foreman. He was 62 years old, married 30-some years to a woman named Ruth who had somehow survived 3 decades on the frontier with her sense of humor intact, which I considered a remarkable achievement. Nate had a low opinion of men who lived alone, said they went peculiar. Said he'd watched it happen to half the men he'd known out in this country, good men who turned inward and strange from having nobody to talk to at the end of the day, nobody to come home to, nobody who required anything of them that wasn't directly related to cattle or weather. I wasn't sure he was wrong. I'd started talking to my horses more than was strictly necessary. I'd also started eating standing up, which struck me as a bad sign. So I wrote. It took me 4 drafts because I'm not a letter-writing man and I didn't know how to put down what I was accurately without making it read like a warning. I was 40 years old. I had a scar that ran from my left ear to the corner of my jaw, a gift from a man in Laredo who'd been faster with a knife than I'd expected. I'd killed men. I owned a good property and I intended to keep it and would work myself to nothing to do it. I was not a romantic man. I was not a gentle man in the way that word usually gets used. But I was not a cruel man either. And I had never once in my life raised a hand to anyone who didn't have a hand raised first at me. And I believed in plain dealing, and I thought I could make a decent life for someone if they were the right kind of person. I sent the letter. 4 months later, the agency wrote back about Evangeline Marsh. I never did meet Evangeline Marsh. Vellard's was mostly empty at that hour. Rosa Vellard brought us coffee and beans and cornbread without being asked. She'd seen me come in enough times to know what I wanted, and she looked at Clara Finch with the frank assessment that a certain kind of woman will give a new face without any apology or embarrassment about it. She'd seen mail-order brides come through before. She was deciding what category this one fell into. Clara Finch ate. She tried not to look like she was eating hungrily, but she was, and I didn't say anything about it. She'd eaten maybe 2/3 of what was on her plate before she set down her fork and looked up. "You should be angry," she said. "Should I? You made an arrangement. You paid the agency fee. You've been—" She glanced at the window at the street, at the town, at everything I'd presumably been waiting in. "You've been waiting." "I have." "And instead of the woman you were expecting, a stranger showed up and told you the whole thing fell through. And you—" She stopped, because even she seemed uncertain about how to characterize what I'd done. "You bought her lunch." "The coat isn't borrowed," I said. She stopped. "You said you came because someone had to. A borrowed coat is something you'd return. That coat's yours. It just wasn't made for you." I drank my coffee. "So who made it for, and why'd you leave in a hurry?" Something went through her face. She controlled it, but not quite in time. "Where'd you come from?" I said, "before Cheyenne." "That's not a pause. Kansas." "What part?" "Abilene." I noted that. The agency was based in Abilene. That was an interesting detail. I didn't say so. "What are you running from?" I said. Her chin came up. "I'm not running from anything. I'm not asking to judge it. I'm asking because it'll affect how I think about the situation going forward." A long silence. A dog had started barking outside at something. Rosa Vellard's daughter appeared at the far end of the room, swept once, and disappeared. Clara Finch looked at the window and then looked back at me, and I watched her make some kind of decision. "My husband," she said. "My former husband, we're not legally, it's complicated. He is not a safe man, and he knows I left, and I don't think he knows where I am yet, but he's resourceful, and he will find out eventually." She said it flat, not asking for sympathy, putting facts on the table the way a capable person does when they've run the situation and know what it contains. "How long ago did you leave?" I said. 18 days. "How long before he traces you here?" "I don't know. He has connections, men who do things for him." A pause, and money. I turned my coffee cup around on the table. I looked at my hands for a moment. I've had occasion to look at my hands and think about what they've done and what they might have to do, and I did that. Then I looked at her. I own 380 acres above the dry Cimarron, I said. A house with solid walls and a lock on every door. I have 2 ranch hands and a foreman who has been with me 9 years and who is not a man who troubles easy. I have a rifle and 2 revolvers, and I know how to use all 3 of them, which is not something I say to most strangers, but which is relevant to your situation. She was watching me. The agency sent you here, maybe not in the way anyone intended, but you're here and you need somewhere safe to be while you figure out what comes next. My house has a room with a bolt on the inside of the door. That's yours if you want it. A very long pause, long enough that I finished my coffee. You don't know me, she said. No. I came here to tell you the arrangement was off. To apologize and leave. I know. And you're offering me a roof and 4 walls and men I trust within shouting distance. I'm not offering anything else. You can leave in a week or a month or stay permanent if that's where it goes. None of that's decided right now. Right now I'm just offering you somewhere safe to be. She looked at me for a long time with those dark eyes that had a way of looking at a thing without letting on what they were finding. Why, she said. It was a fair question. I thought about how to answer it honestly. Because the situation is what it is, I said, and I'm not in the habit of leaving things in a worse condition than I found them. She came to the ranch. I gave her the room at the back of the house, the one with the east window that catches the morning light first thing. I put clean linen on the bed. I laid a fire because the evenings were getting cold already, September having turned sharp overnight like it sometimes does out here. I showed her where the kitchen things were kept, and I told her plainly that she was under no obligation to cook, that I'd managed my own meals for 10 years without assistance and wasn't going to make her feel like she was staff. She nodded, didn't say much. She was careful in those first days, careful the way a person is when they're in a place they're not sure they have the right to be, not making noise, not taking up more space than necessary, watching how things worked before she touched them. I knew that quality. I'd had it myself in certain circumstances, in a time I didn't talk about much. The first week was just the shape of days. I worked. She set things in order in the kitchen and the pantry without my asking, which I noticed without saying so. The third evening she had a meal on the table when I came in from the south pasture, beans and dried venison and cornbread, simple things but hot and properly seasoned. She didn't make anything of it. Neither did I. I sat down and ate, and I told her it was good and I meant it. And she said the cornmeal had a different grade from what she was used to and she'd adjust for it next time. And that was the entire conversation about it. Nate Aldrich met her on the 4th day. He came to the kitchen door on some pretense about the fence inventory and stood there with his hat in his hand looking at her, and then at me, and then at her again, with an expression I'm not going to try to describe. I held his eyes for a moment and told him with mine to let it go, and being Nate, he did, because he'd known me long enough to understand which things I was going to explain and which things I was not. Later at the barn he said, "She's not the one you wrote for." "No. You going to tell me what happened?" "The other woman married someone else." He turned this over the way Nate turned things over. "And this one. She needed somewhere to be." He put his hat back on slowly. "Well," he said. Which from Nate meant, "I have significant thoughts about this situation that I intend to keep to myself, and I consider this conversation finished." I told him about Renfield 2 days later, about the man in Abilene with money and connections. I didn't go into great detail, but I gave him enough, and Nate was smart enough that you never needed to give him the full picture for him to see it. He said, "What do you want me to do?" "Keep your eyes open. Tell me if any stranger asks questions about this property or about me." "Done," he said, and that was that. The man's name was Renfield. I learned this over time, in pieces, the way you learn the true shape of something that a person is still deciding whether to show you, still feeling out whether you're going to flinch. He'd been a businessman in Abilene. Land acquisition, mostly, which in that part of Kansas in those years was a trade that involved buying cheap from people who didn't know the value of what they had, and sometimes helping them not know by means that weren't always strictly legal. He'd done well. He had a house in town and connections to certain officials, and a reputation for getting what he wanted. Clara had married him at 23. She was 26 now. She told me this not all at once but in portions over evenings when the work was done, and we'd sit at the kitchen table with the lamp between us. Her mending or writing in the account ledger she'd found in the drawer and started keeping because she'd noticed I didn't have one. And I'd have my coffee and sometimes a book and sometimes nothing, just the quiet. She'd say something that opened a door and I'd walk through careful, the way you walk into a dark room you know has furniture, but you're not sure exactly where. "He wasn't violent," she said one evening without preamble. "Not he never hit me, I want to be accurate about that." "All right. But he had a way of making you understand that things could go wrong. For you, specifically. That he could arrange for certain things to happen to you or to people near you if you caused him inconvenience." She paused. "And that the simplest way to keep things from going wrong was to do as he said." "That's a particular kind of man," I said. "Yes. I've met a few." She looked at me over the lamp. "What did you do when you met them?" "Depends on the situation." A small silence. Then, "He's going to find me eventually, I want you to know that. I'm not saying it's going to happen tomorrow, but he doesn't let things go." "I know." "When he does," she stopped. "I don't want trouble for you on account of me. This isn't your problem." I looked at her, I put down my coffee. "You're on my property," I said, "under my roof. With my hands sleeping in the bunkhouse within earshot. Anything that comes to this ranch is my problem by definition. That's how it works." She held my gaze for a moment. Something in her face shifted, not softened exactly because she wasn't a soft-faced woman, but something settled, like a thing that has been held at an uneasy angle and is finally, carefully, set down flat. "You're a strange man, Emmett Good," she said. "I'm a plain man," I said. "I'm told they seem strange from a distance." She almost smiled at that. Almost. Clara Finch's almost smiles were already worth something to me, and I'd only known her 10 days. I noted that privately and didn't say it. We married on the 14th of October. It was not a romantic decision in the way stories like to make these things, though I'd be lying if I said it was entirely a practical one either. What happened was this. I'd asked her about 3 weeks in whether she'd given any more thought to what she wanted to do, whether she had family or somewhere she planned to go. She said she hadn't made up her mind, and I said that was fine. She could take the time she needed. 2 days later, she came out to the south pasture where I was running fence with Nate's boy, Hector, who was 17, and tried to look like he wasn't listening to everything. She stood at the fence line with her hands in her coat pockets and waited until I looked up. "I've made up my mind," she said. "Which way?" "I'd like to stay. If you'll still have me." "On what terms?" She'd thought about this. I could tell she'd thought about it carefully and for more than 2 days. "The arrangement your letter described," she said. "I read it. Evangeline showed it to me before she decided otherwise. It was a fair letter. The terms were fair." "That letter was written for your cousin." "I know. I'm asking if those terms apply to someone else." I looked at the fence post in my hands. I looked at Hector, who had discovered something extremely interesting about the wire spool. I looked at Clara, standing straight in the October wind with her chin up and her dark eyes steady on mine. And I thought about 3 weeks of watching her work, of learning her silences, of understanding by that point that she was one of the more determined people I'd ever shared a table with. And that determination was a quality I valued above most others, because it was the only thing that actually mattered when everything else failed. "They apply," I said. We rode to the county seat the following Friday. Judge Harlan Peck married us in his office in about 6 minutes with the same expression he used for deed registrations and land disputes. Clara wore a blue dress she'd made herself in the 2 weeks since she'd decided, because that's what she was, once decided. She moved. She didn't wait for things to come to her. She sewed herself a blue dress and she pressed it the night before and she wore it to her own wedding and she looked, standing there in Judge Peck's office, like a woman who knew exactly what she was doing. I wore a clean shirt and my good boots. Nate Aldrich stood as witness and held his expression the whole time, which cost him something, I could tell. Afterward, Nate shook my hand and then turned to Clara and held her hand in both of his, formal as I'd ever seen him, and said, "Ma'am," with a gravity that I knew meant he was giving her his full approval, which was not a thing Nate distributed easily. Clara looked at him and said, "Thank you, Nate," with the same directness she brought to everything, and something in him settled too. We drove back to the ranch in the wagon. The sky had gone the color it gets out here in October, that deep blue that seems to go on forever, and the cottonwoods along the creek were yellow. Clara sat beside me on the bench, and we didn't talk much on the road back. There wasn't anything that needed saying just then. I cooked that evening. I hadn't cooked since the first week. She'd taken it over, but I cooked that night. She sat at the table and watched me. I put the food on and sat across from her. "I should tell you," I said. "I don't entirely know how to do this." "Do what?" "Be married. I was married before, a long time ago. It ended badly, and the reasons it ended badly are things I've thought about since, and I won't repeat, I don't believe. But I stopped, started again. "I'm not a man who knows how to be easy in a house. I know how to work. I know how to keep people safe. Some of the other parts I'm less practiced at." She looked at me across the lamp. "I was married before too," she said, "and I'm not sure I know how to be married correctly either." A pause. "So we're even on that. We'll figure it out." It was a plain thing to say. Practical. Clara was practical. But it landed on me the way a hand on the shoulder lands, solid and real and steadying. November came in cold and stayed that way. We settled into a shape that felt like it might last, which is the best you can honestly say at 2 months into something. It didn't look like what I'd had before in my first marriage, which had been a younger man's marriage, full of feeling and collision, the kind that burns hot and leaves marks. This was different. This was two people who'd been around long enough to know what they needed and what they could do without, fitting themselves to each other with some care and some patience. Clara had taken over the kitchen the way she took over most things, not by asking and not by announcing it, but by doing it until it was hers. The house smelled different than it had. Something cooking in the evenings, bread sometimes on days she had time, a smell I hadn't had in that house and hadn't known I was missing until it was there. She'd started a garden on the south side of the house in October, which struck me as ambitious. But she'd researched what would win her over, and she was not a woman you argued with about things she'd already researched. I'd watch her from the barn sometimes in the early mornings, out there in the cold with her sleeves rolled up, working with that particular focused quality she brought to everything, a preference for doing things right over doing them fast, an impatience with her own mistakes that I recognized because I had it myself. I started to understand, over those weeks, that the agency's half-page had told me almost nothing about who she actually was. I also started to understand, over those same weeks, that Renfield wasn't going to let this go. I'd sent a wire to a man named Burl Creddy 3 weeks after Clara arrived. Burl was a former U.S. Marshal out of Kansas, a man I'd worked alongside in another life, and who owed me the kind of debt that a serious man feels seriously. I asked him to look into a businessman named Renfield in Abilene and tell me what he found. Burl wrote back in late October. What he'd found was a man named Cassius Foote, who was known to law offices across 3 territories as a tracker and finder of persons, operating in the space between what was strictly legal and what wasn't. Foote had been making inquiries in Cheyenne. Evangeline Marsh's name had come up. He was working his way through the connections, and the connection from Cheyenne to Hatcher Valley was not a long one. I sat with this letter in the lamplight for a while. Then I told Clara. She was at the kitchen counter, her back to me, working dough. She went still when I said Foote's name, the way a person goes still when they hear confirmation of something they already knew was coming. "How long?" she said. Her back was still to me. "Creddy thinks a week, maybe 2, depending on how Foote moves." She turned around. There was flour on her forearms, and her jaw was set in a way I'd learned to read. She looked at me with those steady eyes, and I could see her running the situation, same as I was running it. "What are you going to do?" she said. "Talk to Nate first," I said. "Then I'm going to wire Sheriff Delaney in the county seat and put him in the picture. And I'm going to have some conversations in town, because I know this valley and the people in it, and that's worth something when a stranger rides in asking questions. And I've handled men like Foote before," I said. "He works on people who don't know he's coming. That's where his advantage is. Once you know, the situation changes." She looked at me for a long moment. She looked at me the way she looked at things she was trying to understand fully. Then she set the dough aside and dried her hands on her apron. "All right," she said. "Tell me what you need me to do." That was the thing about Clara. She didn't panic and she didn't go passive. She asked what she could do. I told her to stay visible, to keep to her routines, to tell me immediately if anyone she didn't know came asking questions at the door. She nodded. She went back to her dough. I went to find Nate. Nate didn't need the long version. I gave him enough, and Nate being Nate, he had the right questions. Where did I want him, and where did I want the boys? I told him. He nodded once and went to pass the word. I wired Delaney the next morning. Delaney was a competent man, not a brilliant one, but he was straight, and he knew the law, and he understood the situation when I explained it. He said he'd make note of it and be available if I needed him. I'd also done one other thing, in the weeks between Creddy's letter and now, that I hadn't mentioned to Clara. I'd ridden into the county seat and had a conversation with Judge Peck, the man who'd married us, about the legal situation regarding Clara's prior marriage. Peck was thorough. He spent 2 days looking into it and came back with what I'd suspected. The marriage to Renfield had significant procedural deficiencies, filed in the wrong county, witness signatures that didn't match the names recorded, a date discrepancy that a good lawyer could use. He wasn't certain it would hold up to all challenges, but he was certain it was enough to fight with. I also knew that Clara and I had been married, properly and legally, in Colorado territory, before a sitting judge, with a witness with no deficiencies at all. What Renfield could send Foot to do was find her. What he could not do now was simply collect her and bring her back. He'd have to fight for it in court, in a territory where she had a husband, a property, and a judge who'd signed the documents. I had made her harder to take. That was what I'd done. I hadn't asked her permission because the time hadn't been right and I hadn't fully known I was doing it until I was already doing it, but that was what it was. She didn't know this yet. I'd tell her if she asked. Foot arrived on a Tuesday in early December. I knew he was in the valley the night before he showed up, because Walt Prescott at the livery had a standing agreement with me. Old Walt was a man who saw everything that came through that door and forgot almost nothing, and we'd had an understanding for 2 years. And Walt sent his nephew up the road on Monday evening to tell me a stranger had stabled a horse and asked about properties above the dry Cimarron. I sent the boy back with a coin. I went and talked to Nate. Then I spent that night in the main room in the chair by the door. The rifle was across my knees. I wasn't expecting to use it, but I'm a man who likes to have things within reach. Clara came out around midnight. She came quiet, the way she moved when she didn't want to wake the house. She'd learned which floorboards creaked, and she avoided them. I'd noticed this early on, and it told me something about her years with Renfield, the way you learn which boards make noise in a house where noise has consequences. She came out with a blanket and 2 cups of coffee. She looked at the rifle and didn't say anything about it. She set a coffee on the table beside me. She stood there a moment. "You should sleep," I said. "So should you." "I will in the chair." She looked at me. Then she moved the second chair close to mine and sat down and pulled the blanket around both her shoulders and her knees and wrapped her hands around her cup. "Clara, you stay awake better with company," she said. "That's all." We sat there until past 2 in the morning. The fire burned low. We talked sometimes and were quiet other times. She told me things about Kansas I hadn't known. The way the land looked in spring, flat and green and going on forever. The way the storms came in from the northwest in summer with no warning and no mercy. I told her about this valley in the years before I came, what it had been, what it was now, what I hoped it would be in another decade. She listened the way she listened, completely, without interrupting. She'd ask a question now and then, exactly the right question, the one that told me she'd heard everything. At some point I looked over and she was asleep. Head tipped to the side, the blanket up, her coffee cup on her knee still. The lamp was low. I sat with the rifle across my knees and the fire settling into coals and her asleep in the chair beside me, and I thought, this is what I built it for. Exactly this. Not the big moments. This one. I let her sleep. Foot came at 10 in the morning. He was a lean man, unhurried in the way that careful men sometimes make themselves look. He rode up the road to the house without hurrying and sat on his horse in the yard and called out that he was looking for the property owner. I came out the front door. I'd left the rifle inside. I had both revolvers and I wasn't planning to use either of them. "Emmett Good," he said. "That's right." He looked at the barn where Nate was visible in the doorway, hands easy at his sides, just standing. He looked at the bunkhouse. He was counting, I could see it, assessing the shape of the ground before he committed to anything. "My employer is looking for a woman named Clara Renfield," he said. "Formerly of Abilene, Kansas. He has reason to believe she may have come to this part of Colorado." "I don't know anyone by that name," I said. The woman would be in her mid-20s, dark hair, possibly traveling under another name. "I'm a married man," I said. "My wife is Clara Good. She's been in this valley since September." He looked at me steadily. "I wonder if I might speak with Mrs. Good." "You might not." A pause. "Mr. Good, I'm just trying to—" "I know what you're trying to do," I said. I kept my voice even. I've learned over the years that a level voice unsettles men more than a raised one. "The woman you're describing had a prior connection to a man in Abilene, Kansas. That connection had significant legal questions around it that I've had verified by a judge in this county, procedural deficiencies that make it unenforceable in this jurisdiction, or in most others. My wife is legally married to me and has been since October before a sitting judge, properly filed in this county. She lives on this property, which is mine, free and clear." He said nothing. I continued. "I'd also like you to know that Sheriff Delaney in the county seat is expecting my wire today, which will either tell him this resolved peaceably or tell him otherwise. There are a number of men in this valley who know you're here. They'll remember what you look like when someone asks." I looked at him. "And they will ask?" Long silence. "You're a careful man," Foote said. "I try to be." He looked at Nate in the barn doorway. He looked at the bunkhouse again. He ran his calculation. "My employer has considerable resources," he said. "I expect he does," I said. "He's also going to find it difficult to make a legal case about a woman who is lawfully married to a property owner in Colorado territory, whose prior connection to him has been found deficient by a Colorado judge, and whose current residence is on a ranch with several men who know the valley and know the law and know the sheriff by his first name." I held his gaze. "Tell your employer what you found here. Tell him the situation is settled. Tell him there's nothing in this valley that belongs to him." Foote looked at me for another moment. Then he turned his horse and rode back down the road without hurrying, the same way he'd come. I watched until he cleared the property line. Then I went back inside. Clara was in the kitchen doorway. She'd heard everything through the window. She looked at me, I looked at her. The kitchen was quiet behind her, bread still in the oven, the house smelling of it. "He'll try again," she said. "Most likely, we'll handle that too." I came past her into the kitchen and poured myself what was left of the morning coffee. "He's not going to get what he came for. Men like Renfield, they push until they hit something solid. He's hit something solid." She was still in the doorway, watching me. "Emmett," her voice was quiet. I looked at her. "You married me to make me harder to take back," she said. It wasn't an accusation. She was just putting it in words, seeing how it sat. I thought about how to answer that honestly. "I married you because I wanted to marry you," I said. "The rest of it, the legal protection, that's also true. Both things can be true at the same time." She looked at me for a long time. Then she crossed the kitchen to where I was standing and she put her hands flat on my chest, both of them, and she looked up at me. Her hands were warm. She looked at me the way she looked at things she'd decided about. "Thank you," she said, quiet, direct, Clara to the end. "You don't have to thank me for that." "I know, I'm going to anyway." I put my hands over hers. We stood there in the kitchen with the bread in the oven, and the fire in the stove, and the cold December outside the windows. Renfield tried twice more after that. The second time was a lawyer from Topeka who arrived in January with papers. He came to the house properly, with a letter of introduction, and I read the letter and then took him to Judge Peck, because that's where these things belong. Peck looked over the papers for 2 days, made notes, and came back with 3 specific procedural deficiencies that rendered them unenforceable in Colorado territory. The lawyer from Topeka went home. The third time was a letter, long, addressed to Clara, that came in February. I knew what it was before she brought it to me. She knew too, I think. She handed it to me without opening it. I slid it open and read it, which took a few minutes, and then I put it in the stove. "Bad?" she asked. "The kind of thing a man writes when he's realizing he's lost," I said. "He wants you to feel it." She nodded. She looked at the stove for a moment, watching the paper curl and blacken. Then she went back to what she'd been doing. That was the last of it. Men like Renfield have a calculation, whether they know it or not. They weigh what something costs against what they'll get. And when the cost keeps climbing and the thing keeps moving further away, they find something else to pursue. I'd made sure through Burl Creddy that the right people in Abilene knew what he'd been doing, which added to his calculation a kind of exposure he didn't want. Eventually, he let it go. Clara and I didn't mark it. There wasn't a day we looked at each other and said, "It's done." It just receded the way a hard season recedes when better weather finally comes, and one morning you realize you haven't thought about it in 3 weeks, then 6 weeks, and then it's just the thing you got through. What I want to tell you about is the spring. The spring of 1883 was the kind of spring that makes a man feel the land has goodwill to offer if you've earned it. The creek ran high. The south pasture came in green 2 weeks early. Clara's garden, the one she'd put in against all common sense the previous October, turned out to have survived the winter with more than half its contents intact, which she treated as a personal victory, and which it plainly was. I remember a morning in April when I came around the corner of the barn, and she was standing at the east fence, the one where the light comes in long and low in the early morning. She'd gone out before breakfast in her coat with her coffee cup, just standing there looking at the light on the grass. I stopped and watched her for a moment. She didn't know I was there. I've told you I'm not a man who pictures things, but I had over the winter started to notice that I was building a picture not deliberately, but it was forming itself, the way things do when you stop resisting them. This valley in 10 years, this property in 20, Clara at this fence in every season. The house with its rooms that had already changed shape around her the way a house does when someone has really moved into it, not just occupied it. It wasn't a soft picture. It was the picture of work and weather and the occasional hard thing coming down the road, because that's the only honest picture out here. But she was in it, solid and particular and real. She heard me come up. She didn't turn around. "Good morning," she said. "Morning." I came and stood beside her at the fence. We looked at the east pasture together. "Nate says the South Creek ford needs reinforcing before the real runoff," she said. "I know, we'll get to it this week. I thought I might ride out with you. See what's needed." "You ride?" "I rode before Renfield." She said his name the way she'd learned to say it, just a fact, no charge to it. "He didn't like it. I'm going to start again." "Nate's gray is gentle enough. I'll saddle her." She turned then and looked at me. The morning light was full on her face, and she was 30 years old, and she had that look she sometimes got, the look of someone who is where they intended to be and has just reminded themselves of the fact. "Emmett," she said. "Yes." "I want you to know something." She had both hands around the coffee cup. "I came to Hatcher Valley to explain and apologize and leave. That was the whole plan. I had no expectation of anything beyond that." "I know. And what I have here, what you made possible," she stopped. Shook her head once. "I chose to stay," she said. "I want to be clear about that. You offered and I chose, and I would choose it again. Every morning I would choose it again. That's what I want you to know." I looked at her, at this woman who had stepped off a stage with a borrowed coat and the wrong name and told the truth when she had no obligation to, who had sewed her own wedding dress and bolted her bedroom door and stayed through a hard winter and stood in a kitchen doorway listening while I ran off a man who'd come to drag her back and had said afterward, quietly, "Thank you." Who kept the accounts and rode the gray on Tuesdays and knew every family in a 15-mile radius by name and knew which ones needed the most and quietly made sure they got it. I put my arm around her shoulders. She leaned into me, her side against mine, her head tipped against my jaw below the scar. We stood at the fence in the April light with the creek running high and the pasture coming in green and the whole valley stretched out ahead of us. "Good," I said. That's all I said. She didn't need more and I didn't have more. Some things are plain. I'm telling you this from some distance now. 11 years from that September morning when the deadfall stage came in and I took off my hat. The place looks different. We've added a second barn, rebuilt the creek crossing, put a real smokehouse in that Nate's boy Hector built in his second year of wages and is rightly proud of. There are 2 more rooms in the house. Clara planned them and I built them with Hector's help, 1 summer's worth of weekends. Clara runs the ranch books, which she took over in the second year when it became clear she had a better head for them than I did. And that's true of most things that require patience and precision working together. She delivers mail to the East Valley on Tuesdays, because the county doesn't maintain a rider for that route and somebody has to do it, and she decided she would. And now she knows every family in those 15 miles the way she knows her own shelves. She's helped 3 women through difficult births. She taught reading to 2 of the Cordero children whose mother had no English. She rides the gray. Men in this valley respect her. They respect me too, but that's a different thing. I've been here longer, and I've earned it in the particular way that this country requires a man to earn it, which I'll leave at that. What they have for Clara is something else. A kind of regard that you see when you watch how they speak to her, how they listen. Because she came here without a map, and without any claim on this place, and built a life here through the straight application of will and work and good sense. And in 11 years, she has not once done a dishonest thing or failed to do what she said she'd do. Nate retired 2 years ago, mostly, though he still comes around for the big jobs and drinks coffee at my kitchen table on Thursday mornings, which is what he's been doing for 15 years, and I expect he'll do until he can't anymore. He told me once, about a year after that December morning with Foot, that watching me handle that situation was the most satisfied he'd been with a decision I'd made since he'd known me. I told him that was a low bar, given some of my decisions. He laughed, which from Nate was worth something. Burl Creddy wrote to tell me Renfield had sold his Kansas interests and moved east, which I note without any particular feeling. Men like that always find somewhere else to be. I built something here worth choosing. That's what I want you to take away from this. I built it not knowing whether anyone would choose it. Spent the better part of 2 years building solid walls, and a chimney that didn't smoke back, and a bolt on the inside of the bedroom door, because I believed it was worth building whether or not anyone came to it. She came, not the woman I wrote to, the right one. And there isn't a morning I come around the corner of that barn and see her standing at the east fence with her coffee, the light on her face, the valley spread out ahead of both of us, that I don't know exactly what I have. Exactly what I built and what chose to live in it freely for reasons of her own. That's the whole of it. That's everything. One more thing I want to say while I'm at it. Because people who hear a story like this sometimes think they understand what it was, what it meant, and they get it partly right and partly wrong, and I'd rather set the record straight. Hatcher Valley had a way of talking about things. Small towns always do. They talk about what they know and they fill in what they don't with what seems most likely, and what seemed most likely to most people in Hatcher Valley in the fall of 1882 was that Emmett Good had sent off for a bride and gotten one, more or less. That was the short version. Some people had longer versions that were closer to true. What I want to say is that there was a period, between the October marriage and the arrival of Foot in December, that was not easy in ways I didn't know how to name at the time. Not between Clara and me. We were fine, or as fine as two people can be who are still learning the shape of each other and what that shape requires. What wasn't easy was inside me, separately, in a way I only understood later. I'd been a lone man for a long time. I'd built that way of being into the walls of my days the way you build a fence, practical, solid, designed to keep things in the right places. And having someone in the house, someone whose coffee cup was on the table in the morning and whose lamp was on in the evening, and who had preferences about where things went in the pantry and reasons for those preferences, that took some adjusting. Not because the things themselves were unwelcome. They weren't. But adjusting is work, and I'm not a man who talks about the work he finds hard. There was a week in November where I slept badly for 4 nights running. Not because of Renfield, not then, Creddy's letter hadn't come yet. Just because something in me was still working out whether to trust what I'd been given, whether it was real, whether the floor would hold. I didn't say any of this to Clara, but she knew. She knew because she was paying attention, which is a thing she did with everything she cared about. She came to find me in the barn on the 4th day. I was fixing a harness I'd already fixed twice, which should have told me something. She came in and looked at the harness and then looked at me. "What's wrong?" she said, not a question exactly. "Nothing's wrong." "Emmett." I set the harness down. I looked at this woman in the doorway of my barn with the morning light behind her, and I said the true thing, which was not easy. I don't know how to do this without waiting for it to fall apart. A silence. "What makes you think it's going to fall apart?" she said. "History," I said. She came further into the barn. She stopped a few feet from me. She wasn't a woman who touched easily. She'd been careful about that. And I'd been careful about it too, not pushing for things she wasn't offering, but she reached out and put her hand on my arm just for a moment. "I'm not going anywhere," she said. "I chose this. I meant it when I said it, and I mean it now." She looked at me. "You're allowed to believe me." She took her hand back and went back to the house. I stood in the barn for a while. Then I finished with the harness, actually finished it this time, and I went in for breakfast. It didn't fix everything overnight, but it fixed the worst of it, which was the not knowing whether she'd meant what she said. She'd meant it. I knew it the way you know things that a person tells you plainly, without decoration, without room for doubt. Clara didn't say things she didn't mean. I let myself believe her. After that, the days were easier. After that, I stopped waiting for the floor to give way, and I just lived on it, the way you're supposed to. I said earlier that I'd built the house for someone without knowing I was doing it. I want to expand on that, because it's the part that took me the longest to understand about myself. I've been a capable man all my life. I've known how to do things, physical things, practical things, the things that get done when the situation requires them. I've been able to provide and to protect and to stand between what was mine and whatever was coming at it. Those things I understood about myself for as long as I can remember. What I didn't understand, until I was standing in a barn in November trying to fix a harness I'd already fixed, was that I'd been building things for a long time without knowing who they were for. The ranch, the house, the walls, all of it solid and deliberate and pointing toward something I hadn't named. What it was pointing toward was this: being needed by someone who chose to need you. Not because they had no other option, not out of desperation or accident, but because they looked at what you were and what you'd made, and they decided freely, with their eyes open and their feet already pointed toward the door, they decided to stay. That's the thing, that's what all the building had been about. I knew it when Clara stood at that barn door and said, "I chose this. I meant it. You're allowed to believe me." And I knew it again the morning she stood at the east fence in the April light, leaned into my side, and told me she'd choose it again. Every morning. That's what this life was built for. That's what it holds. I'm an old man now, or near enough. I'm 51, which in a different life would be old. Out here it just means you've learned a few things the hard way and stopped being surprised by the weather. My hands look the way my father's hands looked in his last years, and I don't mind that. My father's hands built things that stood. Clara is 41, and she has gray starting to come in at her temples, which she considers a fact of the situation, and which I consider a thing I have no strong feelings about either direction. She still rides the gray on Tuesdays. She still runs the books with a precision that I find privately astonishing. She still comes out in the early mornings to the east fence sometimes, coffee in hand, looking at the light on the grass. I still come around the corner of the barn and see her there. I still stop. I still look at her for a moment before she hears me. Every time. Because here's what I know at 51 after a life that went the directions it went. The thing that matters is not the big dramatic events, though Lord knows we had a few. It's not the foots and the lawyers and the letters. It's this. A woman you respect who respects you back, who chose you when she could have kept walking and didn't, who has stood at your side in the mud and the cold and the difficult years, and has never once made you feel like she was keeping a tally of what it cost her. That's the whole thing. That's worth everything I had to go through to get here. I took off my hat to a stranger in a street in Hatcher Valley. She told me she wasn't who I was expecting. I picked up her bag anyway. Everything I have grew from that moment, every solid thing,